ministry and operation by focusing on missional alignment and oversight. When you get the culture piece, when you get this is who we are and this is what we're doing, and you are just ruthless, I guess, or judicious about keeping the focus on that, keeping alignment on that, it doesn't actually disempower people. It empowers people, because they know that if they operate within that parameter, that they're being who we are and we're doing what we can do, and that's where you start to see movement, and that's what we're going for. So one of the things that happens all the way along as you grow is that the way the leadership works needs to shift. And you're going to come up against some organizational barriers. These are not spiritual barriers. These are all about relationships and how you're structured for relationship, right? So to get large, you need to get small, right? So you've got to think more in terms of groups. And how do we get groups of 3 to 5 to connect with groups of 40 or 50, to connect to groups of a couple hundred, which connect to groups that are bigger. So if you're not thinking about those kinds of things as a church, you come up with barriers that, Wayne Schmidt would say, many church size barriers are actually self barriers, right? They're barriers that we create by the way that we operate. So a lot of times, I think the best way to think about this is that every church is perfectly designed for the results that it's getting. And so if you're finding that you're, let me help you know if you're hitting a size barrier. So if you come to a certain size and you go over it by 40 or 50 people, and then you drop under it by 40 or 50 people, or 100 people, but either way, and you're doing that repeatedly, you have a size barrier that you're coming up against. It's an organizational, structural, relational barrier. It's not a spiritual barrier. It's a natural obstacle to growth. So you have to think about how might we need to work differently in order to get past this barrier. And most of the time, if you're in a smaller church setting, you're thinking about what can the pastor stop doing? How do we get more people involved in the work of the ministry? As you grow, like if you're in that 200 to 600, it's all about how are we building teams and pushing ministry down, right? So we're creating layers and we're creating groups within the organization. And then when you hit 1,200, when you're coming up against that barrier, there's some systemic and structural things that need to change. And so, again, this book would help you with that I mentioned earlier. And Superintendent Pam can help you with that, because she's been in leadership in organizations of that size. And so encourage you that when you're coming up against those things, find somebody who's already bust through it and talk about that with them and figure out where you're stuck. But one of those things is how the board and the pastors work together. So I want to spend a few minutes just talking about this relationship on a governing board. What does it look like, and how do we work together as these shifts happen? So generally speaking, at the board level, you want to start to develop increasing walls of separation between the roles. So as we talk about this wall of separation, what we're not talking about is siloing. What we're not talking about is going in different directions. What we are talking about is having clarity of role. Clarity of role which empowers both groups to do what they need to do. So on one side you have operations and management. And this is where in our polity the lead pastor oversees this. So as you grow larger, there'll be ministry leaders and ministry teams underneath that. There could be multiple levels of staff. There could be multiple levels of teams as you grow. So that chart might look different. But what this operations side is tasked with is the implementation of the mission, right? So what is it that we're doing to accomplish the purposes that we've been put forth to do? And so they're doing all the tactical planning. Depending on where they're at in the organization, there's probably the things down here, and there's probably some more administrative stuff in the middle. Depending on the size of the church, there's just various factors there. But generally speaking, this side of the house is about the implementation of the mission. So they're doing it. Now, when the board gets into the implementation of the mission, what happens is leaders get frustrated. Okay, because all of a sudden I can't lead. Because you keep stepping in and contradicting me. Or prescribing a different path. Or from your seat on the bus, which is probably far away from where I live in the organization, right? You're using a different set of information and criteria to micromanage. What happens every time when a board operates like that is you're going to lose leaders.
Yep.
Okay, leaders are going to go to a different church because they want to lead. And the Bible says that leadership is a gift of the church. In Romans 12, it actually says, if you have a gift of leadership, let them lead, right? So we want to encourage leaders to lead, but we want to do it in alignment with the mission. So the job of the board is good guardrails, right? Good policies, good missional alignment and culture in the organization, which empowers leaders to lead. When you understand who you are and what you're supposed to do as a church, then you can lead without fear. You know what you're supposed to do. Now, I've never been in an organization ever where you don't have a leader from time to time who goes off the sheet music, right? Well, that's okay. The job of the lead pastor first and the board and the lead pastor together is to keep people on the same sheet of music, okay? But they can play jazz, that's okay, right? They can play jazz. The more talented they are, they can have all sorts of iterations on a theme. What we want is for the theme to stay the same. And so we have the operations over here. We have the oversight on this side. And we're thinking cultural alignment, missional outcomes, strategic planning, which means macro and long term. So if you're in a church of over 600, your board probably shouldn't be doing anything in the 12-month window. Right? You should be thinking further out than that, right? It should be like the operations team that's thinking, what are we doing this year? Right? You should be thinking in the next 3 to 5 years, if we keep doing what we're doing, what is going to happen? What can we do to help move this church forward? And so that sort of thing. Again, the assessment of the health and the accountability of leadership to mission. So the best accountability. So we have a statement in the Free Methodist Church. You'll hear the bishops use it. You'll hear Superintendent Pam use it from time to time. And that is high accountability, low control. Okay, high accountability, low control. So I want to talk about accountability for a minute. Accountability is not gotcha. Okay, it's not I caught you. Aha, I caught you. What accountability is working together towards a mutual goal. So when you're able to have leaders, ministry leaders, pastors, ministry teams working towards the same goal, you can have accountability. Why? Because you're going to the same place. And so if the outcomes are different than what you expected, you can have a conversation about it. That's called accountability. It's not punitive, right? So I'll give you an example in budget, because this is where we live. right? So at the World Ministry Center, we do zero-based budgeting mostly. We're getting there. But every year, all the department heads, I say, what is it that you are going to accomplish missionally for the money that we're going to invest in this department, right? And how much are you going to need to accomplish that? And so they come back with a budget that has 3 to 5 goals typically about what they're going to achieve towards our missional end. And they have their plan for how they're going to do it. Every single time they're asking for more money than we have. Okay, that's awesome. Because we want leaders with vision. And so my job as oversight, and this would be your job as governing boards, is to say, okay, so if we do everything everybody's brought to the table, we're going to have a 30% increase in budget this year. That's probably evangelistically speaking. That's probably a little too much faith, right? So what is it that we feel comfortable that the Lord is saying to us based on all the factors that you're factoring that we're going to be? So let's say that turns into a 15% increase or a 10% increase, right? So what governing boards will do is go back to the leaders. So go back to the pastor and say, listen, we feel comfortable within this profile. We feel like this is missional, this is faith-based, but this also protects the risk that we're doing. So we can only see 10%, right? Now the lead pastor has to say, okay, between 20% or between the 30% and the 10%, how are we going to change the implementation plan? The lead pastor is probably going to look at that overall and might say, well, we're going to cut this department. We're going to cut this plan altogether. Or they might say to their different leaders, I need you to shave X%. Depending on what the priority of implementation is in your specific context. So I just want to encourage you, it's almost never a good plan to just universally say, let's just cut 20% across the board. Right? That's usually an easy way to get out of a missional conversation. Right? Don't do that. So the governing boards just go back to the staff and say, figure it out. So tell us, if we only have 10%, what is that going to do to your goals? Right? Because sometimes we can't do the goals we thought we had if we have 20% less money. Right? So maybe the goals change. But notice what we're not doing is saying you need to cut this event out of your calendar or out of your missional plan. Right? That's when we're getting into the weeds. That's when you're discouraging leaders. Right? So what we want is to have accountability to the missional goal that we have. Right? And so then I would encourage you, once you've approved the budget at the 10%, I would encourage you, at the end of the year, there should be a conversation that says, how do we do to our missional goals? Did we get there? Why or why not? Sometimes that's a management situation. Somebody was in their youthful zeal set a goal that they couldn't reach. And so my grandfather used to say, shoot for the moon and be glad when you clear the fence, right? So there might be some discipleship that needs to happen with that particular leader, right? It might be that the conditions on the ground changed. We live in a highly changing and highly fluid environment. So it might be that things change. But those are questions that should be asked by a good governing board, right? What happened? Why didn't we hit plan? And what do we need to do differently? How should that inform us in the future about how we need to interact together? So, and then one of the things that the board frequently needs to do is kind of that SWOT analysis of what is going on around us that we need to be preparing. What are some threats that might be coming up? What are some opportunities? Not everything is negative. Like, what are some opportunities we need to be prepared to do? And I encourage every church of any size, frankly, to have an opportunities or obstacles fund, right? So if we see something we need to act on quickly as an opportunity, let's take it. If the HVAC breaks down, let's have some money to address that. But anyway, that's in the weeds. I'm sorry. But coming back to this idea of asking the questions that don't get asked. If a governing board doesn't ask the question about how are we doing on the mission really, really practically, nobody else is going to ask that question because everybody's busy doing the work that they know to do. So one of the things that you can't do when you're in a weekly rhythm of ministry and doing all this stuff, unless you set aside time for a retreat, is to ask these big questions. Governing boards need to ask the big questions. So I will give you an example. So the National Church has just negotiated a national agreement on a software called Mission Insight. And this is, think Big Brother, this is what this is. So every church can have access to this information to exegete their community, right? So they can say, if we upload the addresses of people, no names, if we upload the addresses of the people in our church that attend our church, we can examine that comparatively to the people that live in our community. It'll put them on a map. It'll say, how do they fit demographically with the people in your community? If you're, or you can just look at the people in your community, but sometimes it helps to do that comparative analysis, right? And so you can do that comparative analysis, and you're going to be able to see the realities of your mission a lot differently. You're going to look on a map, you're going to say, how come everybody in our church lives at least 10 miles from where our building is located? Right? How come nobody within a 10-mile radius is coming to our church? What does that mean? Right? Those are questions the board needs to ask, right? So now, I will say all this information that Mission Insight accesses about 7 or 8 different demographics information, Experian, the census, so on like that. And so they're not giving you any information that your people haven't already given to somebody else, right? So just for those privacy concerned people in the room. So, but this gives you a lot of good data that you can use as a board to say, how are we doing the mission? Another example would be, we had a, let's say you're thinking, man, somebody in our church feels really passionate about reaching single dads in our community, and we want to start a ministry for single dads. Probably helpful to know if there are any in your community, right? So this is a tool that you can use to see how many single dads are within what radius of your church. Where do they live? Maybe there's a certain part of town where they're congregating, right? You can know where they live. Frankly, if you want to do the work, you can find out their names and addresses and write them a note, inviting them to whatever ministry that you were going to start. You might find out that they live in an adjacent town, right? Wouldn't that be better to know before you spend the money to start a ministry in your town? Listen, this happens. I can give you real stories. We had a church planter once that wanted to start a specific church to a specific demographic, aimed at that demographic. That demographic did not live in the town. The closest group of that demographic were 30 minutes away in a different town, right? It would be helpful to know that, right, before you invest in that work, okay? So this is
Michael, when's that,
shameless plug.
When's that going to be available?
It's available now. Their conference has to come up to speed, so give us a month or two, right? But, yeah.
What was the name?
Mission Insight is the name of it. Don't go out and buy it. There's a lot more you can do with our license, but you can work with Adam or Pam or somebody in the office. We'll get that set up for you.
Let us know if you're interested.
Governing boards are typically smaller because you have to have deep conversations, right? And so typically governing boards would be a little bit smaller than working boards. And they tend to meet less frequently for longer periods of time. Okay, so governing boards have big issues to deal with. One of the ways you can really not help your organization is to try to deal with big issues in 30 minutes. Right? Now you can mitigate that. Somebody over here talked about coming to the board meeting prepared. Okay, that is a necessity if you're going to be a governing board. Because it's not possible for you to both pass the information in the meeting and do the kind of creative work that you need to do. So that is absolutely necessary. But probably you're going to have longer periods of time to talk about it. So sometimes, governing boards meet quarterly for 4 hours instead of monthly for 1 hour, right? Because there's more kinds of deep. Now, I'm not saying that's what you need to do. You can figure this out on your own. You're all smart people. But thinking about allowing time for the conversation. The other thing I would say is governing boards typically have fewer things on their agenda.
Right.
Okay? Than more things on the agenda. Because it takes longer to talk about these kinds of things than it does, hopefully than it does to talk about the paint color in the youth room, right? Okay, but these are some of the practical realities. What I want to mention here is accountability goes both ways. Mostly what we're talking about in accountability is our collective accountability to the mission, right? Not gotcha kind of stuff, right? But every once in a while, people go off kilter, right? So the pastor, you want to help the board stay on mission. I will say most of the time, in my experience, governing boards slip back to working boards because of the agenda the pastor sets for the meeting. Uh-oh. Did I say that out loud? This can be helped if you have a board chair that's not you. But listen, the agenda is important. But you can help the governing board stay missional by the questions you're bringing. Right? You need to bring that level of accountability this way, right? On the flip side of that, it's totally appropriate for the governing board to say, are we on mission? Are we doing what Jesus asked us to do? We have collective accountability to the conference for that. So if you have a pastor who is not on mission and they persistently refuse to be on mission, that's probably a conversation you need to have with your superintendent. We have a mechanism for that. All pastors are not free to lead. Let me say that again. Pastors are not free to lead in a direction that departs from the mission values. So you can have that conversation with your superintendent. I want to flip that though. Friends, board members are not free to lead in a direction that's different than the mission, vision, values of the Free Methodist Church, right? So, and the superintendent has mechanisms to confront that as well. So that's the exception to the rule, not the normative rule, but there are accountability safeguards in our polity there. But the accountability I'm talking about mostly is relational to the mission, right? So high accountability, low control. We're all moving in the same direction. Yeah.
You said something about smaller sizes for governing boards. Do you have a range of size of board?
It's really hard to have deep conversations if you have more than 8 people at the table. So just the more people that you have, the longer it's going to take. So if you want 12 people at the table, you're going to meet for 2 days, once a quarter, right? So it's just practical. These are just practical relational dynamics of the meeting. So there's not like a firm law that says you should only have this many.